My parents were always focused on my sister. When I got engaged, they demanded I adjust my entire wedding for her. I didn't, and got married without them. I never imagined that I would have to tell strangers. I've had a roller coaster of emotions over the past several days, and I feel more conflicted than ever. As they say, desperate times demand desperate measures. I suppose that's the reason I'm now contacting the Reddit community. The recent occurrences have made me doubt everything. And I simply want to know whether I'm doing this incorrectly. For background, my family and I, a 28-year-old woman, have been at odds from the day I was born. I was aware as a youngster that I wasn't the favorite. My parents' universe revolved on my 26-year-old sister, Sophie. Sophie was the one who required continual attention and approval, whereas I was the quiet, self-sufficient one. I was frequently left out, especially at important times in my life, because my parents tended to her every need. I didn't understand as a child why my parents weren't aware of my accomplishments. My birthdays, school recitals, and award ceremonies sometimes passed with little recognition from them. Their explanation was always that Sophie wasn't feeling well. Sophie gave a recital of her dancing. Sophie needed them after having a breakdown. I eventually got used to the pattern, but it still stung. I had learned to quit having high expectations of them by the time I was a teenager. I gave my all to my coursework and extracurricular pursuits in the hopes of finding approval elsewhere. My parents were typically too preoccupied with Sophie's most recent crises to realize that I was succeeding and receiving awards and scholarships. It wasn't that they were indifferent. Simply put, they were more concerned with making Sophie happy. During my undergraduate years, the absence of my parents was very noticeable. I received acceptance to one of the nation's most prominent universities. I was ecstatic, but my parents' reaction when I called to tell them the news was ambivalent. They gave me a quick congratulation before bringing up Sophie's most recent dispute with her pals. They said they couldn't leave Sophie alone, so they didn't come to my graduation either. When I received my first job offer, it was the same experience. Their worry for Sophie's fragile emotional state outweighed my pride and accomplishment. When I was set to take my turn, they never once asked why Sophie was having so many issues. As the years went by, I came to understand that I would never be able to get my parents to put me ahead of Sophie. I so gave up attempting to gain their favor. With people that valued me for who I was, I concentrated on creating a life of my own. Jason and I fell in love right away after meeting at a business convention. He was understanding, encouraging, and kind. Everything I had ever desired in a companion. Unlike my parents, he gave me a sense of worth. I was overjoyed when Jason proposed. At last, I felt like I was the one being valued and taken care of. We began preparing for our wedding, but I couldn't get rid of the persistent fear that my parents would let me down once more. After I told Jason about my worries, he recommended that we have a small private ceremony, attended by only a select group of close friends and family. Knowing that it would lessen the likelihood that my parents would miss out on yet another significant event in my life, I consented. I contemplated whether or not to invite my parents as the wedding date drew near. A part of me hoped they would say no, or offer an explanation, but another part of me wanted them there, if only for show. I knew it was a ticking time bomb, but I had not told them as soon as I became engaged. Ultimately, I chose to be hopeful and give them a call. I called Mom and told her I had some news. My parents hadn't responded well to any of my achievements, so I didn't have great hopes this time. Why would they respond differently to this? And I was correct. To who? Was the first thing they asked when I told them I was engaged, as if they were unaware that Jason and I had been dating for years. I forced myself to remain composed despite the hurtful casual indifference. I told myself to invite them, and somehow make it through this chat. Mom's voice was a mixture of wonder and something else I couldn't quite identify as she inquired, "When did this happen?" I took a time to think before responding. It was a long time ago. The conversation's tone abruptly changed. Suddenly my mother began calling me a horrible daughter for not telling her immediately. She continued by saying that I had always been aloof, that I had never given her feelings any thought, and that it was unjust that I had withheld such significant information from them. Her remarks were like a dagger, shifting the burden on me as though I had done something really wrong by not telling them my news right away. She refused to listen when I attempted to explain that Jason and I wanted to enjoy our engagement in secret for a while before making the announcement. Mom's thoughts were echoed by Dad, who had been quiet up until that point. He said that I had demonstrated utter disrespect for them, and that it was simply another instance of how I had always made my own decisions without taking the family into account. Not only was their response unsatisfactory, but it was also enraging. Here I was thrilled to share one of the most joyful times of my life, but instead of receiving praise or happiness, I received condemnation and shame. I became increasingly aware that this conversation would never proceed as I had intended as they continued to talk. It made no difference what I said, or how I attempted to defend my behavior. Their goal was to convince me that I was at fault. However, the last straw was what happened next. Mom's tone abruptly softened, as though she were attempting to give an olive branch, after their never-ending shame and blame. She suggested that if I made certain changes to accommodate Sophie's demands, they would be willing to attend the wedding. The words lingered in the air, laden with the suggestion that, once more, the most significant events in my life had to be rewritten to fit my sister. To make sure Sophie was content and at ease, they wanted me to alter everything. The date, the location, even the guest list. My wedding seemed like simply another occasion that had to be centered on her. My patience ended at that point. I came to the realization that it would never be sufficient, no matter how hard I tried to include them or how much I leaned over backward. Sophie would always come first, and I would always be expected to give up something. I hung up the phone without saying anything further. They didn't contact me, and I didn't return their call. I realized then that inviting them would only result in more suffering and disappointment. Jason and I carried out our intentions, concentrating on the important things in life and enjoying our love with those who actually cared about us. It was painful to cut that cord, but it was also freeing to finally put my foot down. Another moment of my life was not going to be ruined by them. It was all I had imagined and more on the day of the wedding. Jason and I exchanged vows in a private, happy wedding that was devoid of the poisonous dynamics that had tainted so much of my background, surrounded by people who loved us without conditions. Throughout this difficult period, Jason's family supported me and gave me a sense of belonging. It was a day full of joyous tears, laughing, and the warmth of real family, something I had always desired but had never really known with my parents. Some of my relatives, I should note that they were few in number, began to discuss the absence of my sister and parents. I didn't want to dig into this too much, but I informed one of my cousins about what had happened when I told my parents I was engaged in order to avoid coming out as a naive daughter who hadn't included my impoverished family. Even though there weren't many of them, some of my relatives began talking among themselves about why my parents and sister weren't present. On my wedding day, I didn't want to become too involved. However, I could see the condemnation in their gaze. They viewed me as the naive daughter who failed to invite her impoverished family to such a significant event. I chose to confide in one of my relatives, who came up to me with a worried expression, in order to dispel that perception and correct the record. I told her about my parents' icy response when I told them I was engaged, their unwillingness to come unless everything was customized for Sophie, and the last exchange that ended with me hanging up the phone. I described how I'd reached a breaking point due to their demands, and had no alternative but to proceed without them. Her look changed from one of anxiety to one of comprehension as I spoke. She nodded slowly, understanding that this was the result of years of emotional manipulation and favoritism, rather than just a daughter ignoring her parents. The tale quickly spread among the visitors, and the whispers eventually evolved into sympathetic and encouraging murmurs. The story had evolved by the end of the day. Rather than being viewed as the daughter who abandoned her family, I was acknowledged as someone who had at last advocated for herself. Although it wasn't how I had imagined my wedding day to go, it was an essential step in getting my life and happiness back. Word of my parents' disappearance soon circulated across our extended family following the wedding. There were more than a few murmurs. Gossip spread like wildfire, rekindling long-standing suspicions. My parents' obvious negligence was being publicly criticized by relatives who had previously presumed partiality. What had previously been a closely kept secret inside our immediate family was suddenly publicly visible. The people my parents had worked so hard to please were now scrutinizing and criticizing them for maintaining their image as the ideal loving parents. The calls and texts quickly began to pour in. My parents were furious because the rest of the family was embarrassing them, not because they had missed my wedding. I had never heard them speak in such a frantic manner. A mixture of outrage and fury filled the air. They were rushing to defend their behavior, attempting to place the responsibility on me as though I had harmed them. They asserted that it was my duty to ensure Sophie was at ease and content during my wedding and that I ought to have been more considerate of her needs. They claimed that I had failed them by not caving in to their requests and going above and above to make sure their golden girl was happy. Their logic was almost comical in its boldness. Their insistence that I had stoked a breach in the family by holding the wedding without them, however, was what really got to me. They employed every strategy they could think of, including deception, guilt, tripping, and even bringing up unrelated prior issues. They wanted me to believe that I was the one who had split the family apart and that it was cruel and self-centered of me to put my happiness first. Their statements didn't have the same impact this time though. I had changed from being that little child who would stop at nothing to get their favor. I had had enough of feeling bad about wanting to be treated as respectfully and thoughtfully as Sophie. I held my ground for once. I resisted allowing them to change the story such that I was the antagonist in my own tale. I was happy that my parents didn't interfere with my wedding day, which was meant to be a celebration of my love for Jason. It was a day full of happiness, love, and laughing. Regardless of their absence, it was a day I will always treasure. What do you think, Reddit? Ida for ignoring their golden daughter's requests and for moving on with my wedding without inviting my parents. 1 update. I appreciate all of your generous remarks and unwavering support. It has been enlightening and consoling to read your answers. Although I've always known that Sophie was preferred by my parents, it has given me greater confidence in my choice to have so many others agree with me. Since several of you have inquired about Sophie and the reasons behind my parents' constant attention to her, I wanted to provide a little additional backstory. Sophie had certain emotional and behavioral problems as a child that needed a lot of care. My parents tried their best to make her life simpler since they were always concerned about her. They defended their partiality by claiming that because I was the strong one who could manage things alone, Sophie needed them more than I did. But as we grew older, it became evident that Sophie wasn't actually helped by my parents' strategy. Rather, it made her a person who thought everything should center around her. She has never been able to stay employed for more than a few months at a time and has a history of unsuccessful relationships. My parents have never held her responsible for her behavior and still rescue her from any predicament. I made an effort to comprehend their viewpoint for years. I convinced myself that my parents' intense attention to Sophie was a result of her difficulties rather than a decision. She never learned how to stand on her own 2 feet since my parents were always there to catch her when she tripped. She has been raised with the belief that she would always have someone to clean up her mess, and they have never held her responsible for her behavior. On the other hand, and I don't want to boast, I've put a lot of effort into creating a secure existence for myself. I worked several jobs to support myself while attending college. Even when I was having financial difficulties, I never asked my parents for anything. That, I believe, contributes to their lack of regard for me as a priority. Sophie needs them. More than I have ever needed them. They thus believe I'll be all right without them. They see me as the one who is in control and doesn't require the same amount of assistance. They fail to see, however, that everyone needs love and care, even the strongest people. Sophie texted me after the wedding to let me know she was upset. She felt left out of the wedding celebration since I didn't invite her. I almost laughed at the irony of it all. She was acting like the victim once more, as though she was the main focus of the wedding. I was tempted to reply with an explanation of my decision-making process, but I refrained. Right now, I don't have the energy to put up with her selfishness. She has always been the center of attention, and I'm sick of having to accommodate all of her demands. Throughout it all, Jason has been really helpful. He is always telling me that I don't need to justify myself to anybody, especially those who have consistently placed me last. I'm very thankful to have him at my side during this time, and his words have been a continual source of solace. I haven't replied to my parents' messages or voicemails, but they have persisted in reaching out. I feel guilty every time my phone buzzes, but I remind myself that this is my time. I'm taking some time to concentrate on my new marriage and myself. I'm thrilled to begin this new chapter of my life free from the lingering shadow of my parents' partiality, and Jason and I are organizing a modest retreat, just the 2 of us, away from all the turmoil. The entire situation has served as a wake-up call. I have come to the realization that I cannot continue to compromise my pleasure in order to please people, particularly those who do not respect me as I should. I'm learning to prioritize my own needs, create boundaries, and ultimately put myself first. I'm optimistic that this is the start of a much better and happier life, even if it's a journey and not always simple. I want to thank Reddit once more for giving me a clearer perspective. You have no idea how much your support means to me. The second update. I eventually made the decision to see my folks a few days ago. I believed it may be an opportunity to establish some limits and clear the air. I didn't want an apology. I thought we might at least have an open discussion about how their partiality has impacted me, even though I knew better than to expect that. I still secretly hoped that perhaps, just perhaps, they would pay attention and make an effort to comprehend my perspective. I began to hear more from my family in the days preceding this encounter. My cousin Catherine, who has always been more like a sister to me, reached out despite my attempts to avoid becoming involved in the family drama. I was left reeling after she informed me that there were things I needed to know about Sophie. Sophie made an effort to strengthen her relationship with Catherine when I left for college, and they began spending a lot of time together. Sophie was even introduced by Catherine to her social circle, which consisted of wealthy and influential individuals. Never one to pass up a chance to move up the social scale, Sophie made an immediate effort to blend in. Initially, it appeared to be innocuous enough to borrow clothing and accessories from Catherine. However, things quickly became worse. Without even asking, Sophie started hosting parties at Catherine's house and began taking out loans from her. However, Sophie's treatment of Catherine's relationship was the worst aspect. Catherine had been interested in one of the guys in her buddy circle for a while. Sophie immediately made a pass on him after she told her about her thoughts. She talked to him non-stop and even distributed false information about Catherine in an attempt to win him over. Sophie wasn't finished, even if Catherine and the man finally reconciled after resolving their differences. She made a pass on him herself in an attempt to ruin their relationship. Sophie told him that Catherine had cheated on him in retaliation for his rejection of her and declaration of his commitment to her. They broke up with Catherine, who was crushed and saddened as a result of the deception and deceit. I no longer had any regard for Sophie after hearing this. It strengthened my commitment, even though I hadn't intended to discuss it with anyone. I was aware that nothing my parents said in our meeting would alter how I felt about Sophie, or how they treated me. Things didn't go as planned during the meeting. In actuality, it was a complete mess as soon as I entered and noticed Sophie was also present. I hadn't spoken to her in years, mostly because I couldn't stand the way she spoke, which was usually laced with manipulation or self-pity. However, she appeared to have experienced the greatest betrayal possible as she sat with our parents. It was obvious from her presence that we would not be discussing my emotions or experiences. As usual, Sophie would be the main focus. My parents jumped in as soon as I opened my mouth to speak. They began berating me for not inviting them to their own daughter's wedding, saying they were shocked and disappointed. They said that many of our family members had treated Sophie rudely, and that I should have taken her sentiments into consideration when organizing my wedding, accusing me of being insensitive to her feelings. It felt like I was speaking to a brick wall when I attempted to convey that this was my day, and that it was meant to be about Jason and me rather than Sophie. Simply put, they were unable or unwilling to see it my way. They got defensive when I mentioned how their obvious bias had harmed me over the years. They suggested that I should be more understanding of Sophie's difficulties and that they had done their best in the circumstances. They kept returning the subject to her as though she were the only member of the family whose feelings were important, but my only query was, what struggles? That she was way too pampered. By claiming that I was being overly sensitive and that I needed to move on from the past, my father even attempted to cast me as the unreasonable one. My mother's accusation that I was punishing them by proceeding with the wedding without making accommodations for Sophie was the last straw. She suggested that I had driven them away by not delaying the wedding until after Sophie was more stable. Sophie said that she had been severely affected by my actions, and that I had purposefully left her out of the wedding in order to cause her pain. If her dramatic displays of betrayal and crocodile tears weren't so annoying, they would almost be funny. At that point, I broke. I informed my parents of what Catherine had told me about Sophie's actions, including how she had deceived our cousin, propagated false information, and ruined relationships out of pure greed. I realize I could come out as snitching, but I had had enough of their long-winded justifications for Sophie's actions. I wanted them to know the truth about their golden kid for once. In stunned silence, my parents listened. Sophie appeared somewhat ashamed as well, although it was short-lived. They began to settle down after a short while, as though they were truly taking in what I had said. However, they shifted the responsibility back to Catherine and myself, just as I believed I might have reached them. They charged us with plotting Sophie's downfall and attempting to incite the family against her. They insisted that Catherine and I were only envious and resentful of Sophie's unique needs and refused to accept that Sophie could be capable of such things. The weight of all the years I had spent feeling ignored and unheard by my parents struck me hard at that very moment. Something inside of me changed as I sat there listening to their weak defenses and their persistent insistence that I put Sophie's needs ahead of my own. I was able to view the issue clearly, as if a cloud had lifted. They would never recognize me for who I really was or value the work I had done to establish a life of my own, regardless of what I said or did. It was a freeing and terrible epiphany. I had devoted so much of my life to winning their acceptance in the hopes that they would eventually see my value. However, I realized then that I couldn't alter their partiality. It had nothing to do with me or anything I had done. It has to do with their failure to look past Sophie's problems and needs. I was portrayed as the resilient daughter who could do anything by herself. Furthermore, they would never let me leave that position. I became aware of the depth of their denial as they persisted in defending Sophie after I had exposed her betrayal of Catherine. Instead of confronting the reality about their beloved Sophie, they would prefer to place the blame on Catherine, myself, or anybody else. At that moment, I realized there was no longer any chance of a genuine, honest connection with my parents. They were too firmly rooted in their story, and too determined to keep Sophie safe at any costs. Soon after, I exited the meeting. I no longer wanted to make amends. It was evident from the discourse that there was no chance of reconciliation. I explained to my parents that things were different today than they were when I was a child, and they could neglect me and yet count on me to return. Now that I had my own family, I had created a life in which their presence was neither required nor particularly wanted. I most definitely didn't need them in my future life if I didn't need them during my wedding. The feeling of closure intensified in the days that followed. I concentrated on the future we were creating together and my new life with Jason. Now, there are more important matters to attend to. Now let's see what occurs. The third update. Hello everyone, I hope everyone is doing well. I would want to provide you with a last update on my life. Jason and I are enjoying our time together and getting used to our new schedule. Building our life and making the most of our new beginning have been our main priorities. I had all but given up on any change in the family situation. I believed that there would be no possibility of reconciliation given how things ended, but my dad phoned me out of the blue. He left me a voicemail, but I was at work and couldn't answer his call right away. He apologized for all that had transpired and expressed his hope that I was doing well. I gave him a call back later that day. He expressed his sincere regret and said that he had been disturbed by many of the things he had heard about Sophie from friends and family. As it happens, many members of the extended family had been discussing Sophie's problems and how they affected Catherine and other people. Dad acknowledged that the severity of Sophie's actions and the impact they had on others around her astounded him. He informed me that he still wanted to remain in my life even if he didn't think I would forgive him immediately. He also said that my mother remained in denial about the issue and was still totally preoccupied with Sophie. It seems like Mom was unaware of all the problems with Sophie and continued to believe that her daughter was innocent. It seems that ignorance truly is bliss. Dad stated he was willing to accept any choice I made and that he understood if I wasn't ready to mend our relationship. Even if it took some time, he showed a sincere desire to make amends and be in my life. I had a glimmer of optimism regarding my connection with my parents for the first time in a long time. After discussing it, Jason and I decided that it would be worthwhile to take a cautious approach. We are open to gradually re-establishing some sort of contact with my parents, but we are not prepared to immediately return to a close relationship. Having my dad reach out with an apology and a desire to make apologies has given me some optimism, even if it will take time and be a cautious approach. It's weird to consider what the future could bring, and I'm still absorbing everything. I'm making an effort to concentrate on the good things that have happened in my life and the new chapter that Jason and I are creating. Along with my parents, I'm attempting to strike a balance between the prospect of re-establishing contact and my personal recovery. I sincerely appreciate all of your help and guidance during this trip. Your remarks have kept me grounded and have been a great comfort. I'm appreciative of this community and all the viewpoints expressed. Although it's been a difficult period, I believe I'm at last heading in the direction of a position where I can confidently and hopefully embrace my future. So, that's the current situation. I'm trying to make the greatest choices for my family and myself by taking things carefully. Once again, I want to thank you for joining me on this trip. If anything else changes, I'll let you know. Everyone, be careful.